The Great Pyramid of Giza. More than 2 million blocks of stone, raised into a mountain that aligns with true north to within a fraction of a single degree, built roughly 4,500 years ago in the span of about 2 decades. For centuries, one question has driven people half mad. Who actually built it, and how? And for most of that time, the honest answer was little more than educated guessing. That silence left a vacuum, and into it rushed gods, lost civilizations, and visitors from the stars. Then, in just the last few years, 2 things changed everything: a logbook pulled from a sealed cave in the desert, and a complete genome read from a single ancient tooth. What they revealed is stranger than any myth, for one simple reason: it is human. The truth had been waiting in the ground the whole time. When something this old and this precise turns up in the human record, imagination tends to arrive long before evidence does. And imagination, faced with a thing it cannot easily explain, is remarkably inventive. The theories began almost as soon as people started looking closely, and they all grew from a single seed: the belief that ordinary ancient Egyptians, armed with copper tools, rope, and sweat, simply could not have done this. Something greater must have been involved. Something lost, something from elsewhere. And from that one assumption, an entire ecosystem of alternative explanations bloomed. There is the lost civilization theory, perhaps the most seductive of all. The writer Graham Hancock has argued for years that an advanced culture, sophisticated and now completely vanished, once existed before recorded history, and that places like Giza are the inheritance it left behind. In his telling, the Egyptians did not develop their genius alone. They received it, passed down in fragments from a forgotten people, whose own monuments were swallowed by catastrophe. It is a compelling story. It is also a story searching for facts rather than following them. Then there is the Sphinx. The researchers Robert Schoch and John Anthony West examined the deep weathering on the monument and its surrounding enclosure and argued that the rounded vertical erosion was carved by heavy rainfall, not by wind and blowing sand. And the last time enough rain fell on that desert to do such work was many thousands of years before Egypt, as we know it, existed. If they are right, the Sphinx would predate the pharaohs entirely, the work of some far older hand. Geologists found the argument hard to dismiss. Egyptologists, for the most part, simply stepped around it. Then there is the sky. Robert Bauval noticed that the 3 Great Pyramids of Giza mirror the 3 stars of Orion's belt, and argued that they match the sky not as it looked in the age of Khufu, but as it appeared around 10,500 years before the Common Era, thousands of years earlier than history allows. Orion carried deep meaning in ancient Egyptian thought, tied to the figure of Osiris and the cycle of death and renewal, so the alignment felt freighted with intention. To Bauval, the stones were a map of a sky no pharaoh should have known. Then there are the stones themselves. The engineer Christopher Dunn studied the granite inside the pyramid and pointed to perfectly round drill cores, precise cuts, and surfaces flat to a tolerance he found difficult to credit. These were not, he argued, the marks of men chipping patiently with soft copper. They were the marks of machines, of power tools, of a technology that should not have existed for thousands of years to come. And running beneath all of it is a quieter theory, less about the past than the present, that the truth is being withheld, that access to certain chambers has been restricted, certain investigations quietly halted, certain doors left sealed, not to protect the monument, but to protect a story. In this version, the mystery endures not because the answer is lost, but because someone prefers the question never be fully asked. Each of these theories is built with real care, and each one deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away. They are not stupid. They are seductive precisely because the pyramid is so staggering that a human explanation can feel too small to contain it. How could people without iron, without the wheel as we use it, without a single machine, raise 2 million blocks into a structure that still humbles modern engineers. The mind reaches for something larger to fill the gap, and these theories offer exactly that: a lost golden age, a hidden sky, a vanished technology, a guarded secret. But notice what every one of them quietly assumes: that the actual human beings who lived in the Nile Valley 4,500 years ago, who farmed it, governed it, and worshipped along it, were not capable of this on their own. Not clever enough, not organized enough, not advanced enough. That assumption has deep and unflattering roots in an old habit of looking at people of the distant past and seeing something closer to children than to equals. It is a condescending idea, and it is wrong. Because while the theories multiplied above ground, the evidence was accumulating below it, not in the form of alien tools or drowned cities, but in something far more ordinary and far more powerful: a town, a graveyard, a logbook, and eventually, the genetic code of a man who lived in the very age the pyramids rose. The ground had been answering the question all along. We had simply not yet learned to read it. The first thing the ground gave up was not a temple, not a vault of treasure, not the relic of a vanished race. It was a town, an ordinary working town, and the people who lived in it were the people who built the pyramids. For a long time, almost no one looked for it. The pyramids themselves were so enormous, so magnetic, that the question of where their builders ate and slept and were buried barely registered. 20,000 people, perhaps 3 generations of laborers, had vanished from the record without a trace, as though they had never existed at all. Then, in 1988, the American archaeologist Mark Lenner, working with the team he would come to lead, the Ancient Egypt Research Associates, began digging into the sand southeast of the Great Monuments. And what he uncovered, season after patient season, was a city. It had a name now used by archaeologists: Hayt el-Ghurab, the Wall of the Crow, and it was not a scatter of crude huts. It was planned. Long galleries that likely served as barracks, laid out in orderly rows. Bakeries, their floors still holding the shapes of bread molds. Breweries. Granaries for storing grain in bulk. Storerooms, workshops, and an administrative core where the work was organized and recorded. There were streets, there was drainage, there was the unmistakable signature of central planning, of an authority deciding how thousands of people would live while they raised something that had never been built before. This was infrastructure, deliberately designed to house, feed, and direct a workforce on an industrial scale. And the timing was not vague. Radiocarbon dating placed the life of this town squarely within the reigns of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, the 3 kings whose pyramids dominate the Giza plateau. This was not a settlement that happened to sit nearby. It was the construction camp itself, alive during the exact decades the stones were going up, and falling quiet once the work was done. Then there is what these people ate, because the diet tells its own story, and it is not the story we were taught. For generations, the image of pyramid building was an image of suffering. Whipped slaves, starved and broken, dragging stone until they dropped. The food remains say something very different. The kitchens and refuse pits at Giza are full of the bones of cattle, sheep, and goats, along with fish and the residue of bread and beer. This was not the diet of the disposable. By the reckoning of the archaeologist Zahi Hawass, the site consumed something on the order of 21 cattle and 23 sheep every single day, enough meat to feed a workforce numbering perhaps 10,000 people. Beef, in particular, was a luxury in ancient Egypt, eaten regularly by the elite and rarely by the common farmer. Yet here it was being delivered to the builders by the herd, day after day, year after year. Think about what that requires. to feed 10,000 laborers fresh meat and bread and beer every day. For decades, you need farms producing a surplus, herds being driven in from the provinces, boats and roads moving food to the plateau, granaries holding reserves against a bad season, and administrators tracking all of it so that no one went hungry and the work never stopped. The town is not just evidence of where the builders lived. It is evidence of one of the most sophisticated logistical operations of the ancient world, a state machine capable of mobilizing and sustaining an entire temporary population in the open desert. And none of it points outward. There is nothing in this city that hints at alien hands or lost technology or a drowned golden age. There are no impossible tools. There are bread molds and beer jars and the broken pottery of daily life. There are the ordinary remains of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. The picture that rises from the sand is not of a mystery deepening, but of a mystery dissolving, replaced by something more human and, in its own way, more impressive. A society that could organize itself, feed itself, and bend its collective will toward a single, monumental purpose. But a town can only tell you so much. It tells you that people lived here, that they were fed, that they were managed and housed and supplied. It tells you how they ate. It does not yet tell you who they were, or how their bodies bore the weight of the work, or whether they came willingly or in chains. For that, you have to go to where they were laid to rest. And the cemetery, when it was found, would settle the oldest and ugliest assumption of all. 500 meters west of the workers' town, the ground gave up its second secret: a cemetery. Not a royal necropolis of gilded chambers and painted walls, but the graves of the laborers themselves, the men and women who lived in that city and died in the service of the pyramids. It was uncovered beginning around 1990 under the direction of the archaeologist Zahi Hawass, and it answered the oldest and ugliest assumption about this place more decisively than any argument could. Because slaves do not get tombs. The people buried here were laid to rest in modest but deliberate structures, small graves shaped from mud, brick, and stone, some topped with little vaulted domes and miniature versions of the very pyramids they had helped to raise. They were buried with provisions for the afterlife, jars that had once held bread and beer, the same food they had eaten in life, sent with them into death. This is not how a society treats people it considers property. You do not feed your slaves beef, house them in an organized city, set their broken bones, and then bury them with honor in the shadow of the king's own monument. The cemetery is, in itself, a quiet and complete refutation of the whip and chain story that haunted this place for centuries. And then there are the bones, which speak more plainly still. These skeletons are not the remains of the pampered. They are the remains of people who worked, and worked hard. Their spines show the compression and wear of a lifetime spent lifting and hauling heavy loads. Their joints carry the unmistakable signature of arthritis, ground down by years of repetitive strain. The lower vertebrae in particular tell of bodies bent again and again under weight they were never quite built to carry. By every measure, this was brutal physical labor, and it left its mark on every frame pulled from the sand. But that is only half of what the bones reveal, and the other half is the part that changes everything. Alongside the wear and the strain, the skeletons show healing. Fractures that had been set, cleanly and deliberately, and allowed to mend. Bones that had been broken and then knitted back into usable shape. The work of someone who knew what they were doing. There is even evidence of limbs amputated and patients who survived the procedure living on for years afterward. This is not the medicine you waste on the disposable. This is organized, skilled, sustained medical care, doctors and healers kept on hand to treat the injured and return them to the work. A society that mends its laborers is a society that values them. The picture that emerges is of a workforce that was hard-pressed but cared for. People who broke their bodies on the stone, yes, but who were also fed, housed, healed, and ultimately honored. And the evidence suggests they did not all toil here for life. Many appear to have come and gone in rotation, ordinary farmers and villagers cycling through the great project in shifts, likely organized around the seasons when the annual flooding of the Nile drowned the fields and freed up the labor of the countryside. They would serve their stretch, eat well, learn the work, and return home, replaced by the next group. Not a permanent population of the enslaved, but a nation taking turns, by the tens of thousands, to build the thing that would outlast every one of them. So consider what the ground has now produced, before a single line of ancient text or a single strand of DNA has entered the story. A planned city, dated precisely to the age of the pyramids. A diet rich in meat and bread and beer, sustained by a vast logistical machine. A cemetery of honored graves topped with tiny pyramids. And skeletons that record both the cost of the labor and the care taken to keep the laborers whole. Every piece of it points in the same direction, and the direction is human. Ordinary, organized, valued human beings. There are no anomalies here, no tools that shouldn't exist, no remains that defy explanation, no fingerprint of a vanished master race. There is only the accumulated, unglamorous, overwhelming evidence of a society capable of feeding and healing and burying the people who served it. The bones do not lie, and what they say is simple. People built this. People who ate and ached and healed and were grieved. And yet, for all its power, the cemetery still leaves one question unanswered. It tells us how the builders lived and died. It does not tell us, in their own hand, what they did or whose name they did it in. For that, we have to go inside the pyramid and into a cave beside the sea. Up to this point, the evidence has been circumstantial, powerful, but indirect. A city, a graveyard, a scatter of bones. None of it speaks in words. But there are two pieces of evidence that do, and they come from the builders themselves, in their own hand. The first was hidden inside the pyramid. The second was buried in a cave beside the Red Sea. Together, they settle the question of who built this, and in whose name, beyond reasonable doubt. Start inside. High above the king's chamber, the builders left a series of hollow spaces stacked one atop another, almost certainly designed to spread the immense weight of the stone above and keep the burial chamber from collapsing. These cramped, lightless rooms were never meant to be entered, never meant to be seen by any living eye once the pyramid was sealed. And it is exactly there, on the rough stone of those concealed chambers, that the workers left their marks. Daubed in red ochre, casual and unself-conscious, are the names of the work gangs who hauled and set the blocks. They named themselves after the king, and the names carry a startling warmth. One crew called itself the Friends of Khufu. Another, working on a later pyramid, called itself the Drunkards of Menkaure. There are tally marks, directions, and a dateline recording a year of the reign of Khufu himself. Some of these marks sit behind blocks in places only the men who placed the stones could ever have reached. This matters more than it might first appear, because one of the most repeated claims about the Great Pyramid is that nothing inside it names Khufu, that the link between the king and the monument is an assumption with no solid footing. That claim does not survive contact with these chambers. Here is Khufu's name, written by the laborers, in spaces no forger could have staged and no later visitor was meant to find. The pyramid is signed, not on its grand surfaces, but in its hidden bones, by the very crews who raised it. In the absence so often pointed to, the empty granite sarcophagus, the missing body, the lack of treasure, is not a mystery at all once you account for time. This monument stood for thousands of years in a land that never stopped being inhabited. It was broken into and stripped in deep antiquity, its contents carried off by robbers long before any archaeologist arrived. A looted tomb is not evidence that it was never a tomb. It is evidence that it was a tomb worth robbing. Then there is the second voice, and it may be the most extraordinary document in the entire story. In 2013, a French team led by the archaeologists Pierre Tallet and Grégory Marouard was excavating an ancient harbor at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast when they found, sealed inside man-made caves, a collection of papyri. They are the oldest inscribed papyri ever discovered anywhere on Earth, and one of them is a diary. It was written by a man named Merer, a middle-ranking official, a kind of logistics inspector, and it is a plain, almost mundane work log kept day by day across several months. Merer records the movements of his crew, a team of roughly 40 men, as they ferried great blocks of fine white limestone from the quarries at Tura, across the Nile and along a network of canals, to the building site. And he names that site. He calls it Akhet Khufu, the Horizon of Khufu, the ancient name for the Great Pyramid. The diary is dated to around the 27th year of Khufu's reign, the very period the pyramid was rising. Sit with what that means. This is not a later legend, not a Greek traveler's secondhand tale, not an inscription added centuries afterward. This is an eyewitness account of the construction of the Great Pyramid, written while it was happening, by a man who was part of the operation. We have the foreman's logbook. We can read his entries about the weather, the river, the hauling of stone to a monument that has stood ever since. And almost in passing, Merer's diary dissolves one of the loudest mysteries of all, the question of how the Egyptians moved their colossal stones. He tells us, they moved them by boat, along the river and through engineered waterways, exactly as a sophisticated state with mastery of the Nile would. No exotic machinery required, just water, timber, rope, organization, and an enormous amount of coordinated human effort. The town told us they lived. The bones told us they labored. Now the stones in the diary tell us, in their own words, exactly what they did and for whom, which leaves only the theories themselves, still standing and waiting to be taken apart. So let us return to the theories, now that the ground has armed us, and take each one apart with the evidence it was always missing. They deserve that much. Not a dismissive wave, but a proper reckoning with what people of this era were genuinely capable of doing. Start with the precision of the stonework, the perfectly round drill cores and the flat granite surfaces that Christopher Dunn argued could only have come from machines. The trouble is that experimental archaeologists have reproduced these very cuts using nothing the ancient Egyptians did not have. A copper saw, fed with wet quartz sand as an abrasive, will work its way through granite, the hard sand grains doing the cutting while the soft copper merely carries them. A bow drill turned with the same sand abrasive will bore the cores. The work is slow and patient, but it leaves exactly the marks we see. The precision is not the signature of lost technology. It is the signature of accumulated skill and almost limitless patience. Take the alignment to true north, accurate to a fraction of a degree, so often held up as impossible without modern instruments. It is not impossible at all. A people who watch the sky as closely as the Egyptians did could fix true north by tracking the rising and setting points of stars, or the shadow cast by a vertical pole across a day. The methods are simple, repeatable, and entirely within reach of a culture that built its calendar and its religion around the movements of the heavens. Take the transport of the great granite blocks, some weighing many tons, hauled from Aswan more than 800 kilometers to the south. We no longer have to guess how they did it, because Merer told us they floated them. The Nile and its engineered canals were the highway, and barges were the trucks. The mystery of the moving stones was solved by a logbook written by a man who moved them. Then there is the Sphinx, and the claim by Robert Schoch and John Anthony West that its deep, rounded weathering was carved by heavy rain, pushing its origin back many thousands of years before the pharaohs. The geology has a quieter explanation. The Sphinx is cut from soft, layered limestone that erodes unevenly and rapidly, and salt within the rock crystallizes and flakes the surface in patterns that can mimic water erosion. The early dynastic climate was also wetter than today, with rain enough to weather stone within the conventional timeline. But the decisive point is not geological at all. If some advanced civilization carved the Sphinx 12,000 years ago, it left nothing else behind. No tools, no settlement, no graves, no pottery, no trace whatsoever in the genetic record of the people who came after. The silence is total, and it is fatal to the theory. Take Robert Bauval's mapping of the three pyramids onto Orion's belt as it sat around 10,500 years before our era. The alignment is approximate, and reaching it requires choosing which stars to match and how, then sliding the date back until the picture fits. The pyramids were aligned with great care to the cardinal directions of their own age. Reading a far older sky into them is an interpretation laid over the stones, not a message left within them. And the sealed voids, the great cavity detected above the Grand Gallery by cosmic ray scanning in 2017, and the corridor found behind the north face soon after. These are real. They were found by careful science, and they are genuinely interesting. But the most likely explanation is the least sensational one. They are structural, spaces left to relieve and distribute the colossal weight of the masonry, the same engineering logic that produced the chambers above the king's chamber. A hidden space is not a hidden technology. Here, honesty demands a limit, stated plainly. Not every question is closed. The exact purpose of that great void is still debated. The precise design of the ramps used to raise the blocks remains an open argument among serious scholars. There is real mystery left in the Great Pyramid, and there always will be. But an open question is not a doorway for aliens, and a gap in our knowledge is not proof of a vanished super race. It is simply the ordinary edge of what we have so far managed to learn. Every one of these theories, beneath its surface, rests on the same crumbling foundation, the belief that ordinary Egyptians could not have done this. And there was one place that belief had not yet been tested, not in the stones, but in the blood. For most of human history, the dead of ancient Egypt kept their deepest secret. We could read their inscriptions and measure their bones, but who they actually were in the most fundamental biological sense, where their ancestors had come from, what blood ran in their veins, all of it had vanished into the dry earth. And here honesty demands a limit, stated clearly the same way it was stated for the stones. We do not yet have the genome of a man pulled from the workers' cemetery at Giza. Egypt is a brutal place for ancient DNA. The relentless heat breaks the fragile genetic material down until almost nothing readable survives, and for decades that wall seemed all but impassable. A handful of much later Egyptian samples had been recovered, but nothing from the age of the pyramids, nothing from the people who raised them. The blood, it seemed, would stay silent. Then, in 2025, that silence broke. A team led by the researcher Adeline Moraz-Jacobs, publishing in the journal Nature, announced something that had never been achieved before. They had sequenced the first whole genome of an ancient Egyptian. Not a fragment, not a scattering of markers, but a complete genetic portrait, read in full. And the man it belonged to had lived in exactly the window that matters. His remains had been found long before, buried in a sealed ceramic pot inside a rock-cut tomb at a place called Nuwayrat, south of Cairo. That pot, sealed away from the air inside the cool stone, had done what the Egyptian climate almost never allows. It had preserved his DNA. When the scientists dated his bones, the result placed him between roughly 2,800 and 2,500 years before the Common Era, bridging the early dynastic period and the dawn of the Old Kingdom. This was a man who lived in the age of the first Great Pyramids. For the first time, science could look directly at the genetic makeup of someone from the very era that has driven so much wild speculation. His skeleton told its own story before his genes said a word. He had been a man of some age for his time, somewhere between 44 and 64 when he died, which was itself unusual, and his bones bore the marks of a hard physical life. Severe arthritis. Patterns of wear in his muscles and joints consistent with years of demanding, repetitive labor, with sitting hunched and straining over physical work for a very long time. This was not a pampered aristocrat. This was a working man, his body shaped by toil, exactly the kind of human being who lived and labored in the shadow of the rising monuments. And then his genome spoke. About 80% of his ancestry was best explained by the deep population of North Africa, the long-rooted people of the Nile and the lands around it. He was, overwhelmingly, a local man, descended from those who had lived in that corner of the world for thousands of years. But around 20% of his ancestry traced somewhere else, eastward, to the region of the Eastern Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. This was the discovery that made the world sit up. For a long time, scholars had known that ideas, crops, and goods had moved between Mesopotamia and Egypt in those early millennia. Here, written in a man's chromosomes, was the first hard evidence that people had moved too, that the two great cradles of civilization were linked not only by trade routes, but by blood. Notice what is not there. There is no anomalous ancestry that fits no known population, no mysterious lineage dropped in from nowhere, no genetic ghost of a vanished master race, no impossible founders timed to the rise of the pyramids. There was movement, yes, the ordinary traffic of neighboring human worlds across a few thousand years. But it is exactly the kind of movement we see between real, traceable, entirely human populations. The blood tells the same story the city told, and the bones told, and the diary told. It simply tells it at the deepest level we can reach. A rooted North African people with an ancient strand reaching east toward Mesopotamia, working, aging, aching, and being buried in the land they had always known. That is who lived in the age of the pyramids, not gods, not strangers from the stars, not the survivors of a drowned golden age. People whose ancestry we can now read gene by gene from a single tooth. Every line of evidence had pointed here, and now the last and most intimate of them had arrived, which leaves only the question of what all of it, taken together, actually means. For most of history, who built the pyramids sounded like a riddle with no floor, and the silence beneath it filled with gods, lost civilizations, and visitors from the stars. It is no longer a riddle. We have their city, we have their graves, we have their gang names scrawled in red ochre above the king's burial chamber. We have a foreman's logbook describing the limestone moving by boat to the rising pyramid. And now, from a single tooth, we have the genome of a man who lived and labored in that very age. The answer that changes everything is not that something more than human built this. It is that people did. Traceable, organized, cared for people whose names we can read on the stone and whose ancestry we can now read in their blood. They looked at bare desert and raised the only ancient wonder still standing. They needed no one's help.